The neoconservatives had already developed their plan to reconfigure the Middle East. According to them, this would make the Middle East more peaceful, democratic, and less a threat to the United States. However, this plan to reconfigure the Middle East would entail the elimination of regimes that were hostile to Israel, beginning with Iraq and including Iran, Syria, and even Saudi Arabia. Now, this plan had strong similarities to a geostrategy that prevailed on the Israeli right in the 1980s and was best articulated by Likudnik Oded Yinon in a 1982 article. In that article, he maintained that Israel's enemies were quite fragile and only held together by harsh dictatorial regimes. This, he claimed, would make it relatively easy to bring them down since there wasn't any natural support in these countries for them. And he held that if these countries were disturbed by war, they would fragment into ethnic and sectarian groups who would war among each other. Of course, this would, by weakening Israel's enemies, this would, of course, enhance the security of Israel. And Yinon advocated that Israel launch a war.
I'm going to be talking about a clean break, a new strategy for securing the realm, which was a policy document that was prepared in 1996 by a study group led by Richard Perle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a couple of sites, including the document itself. I'm going to point out the problems of the document and why those problems are relevant today in today's foreign policy, which has been primarily influenced by the Israeli Public Affairs Committee as well as the Saudi lobbyists, which are much more covert than the Israeli lobbyists. The report explained a new approach to solving Israel's security problems in the Middle East with an emphasis on Western values. And this comes at the heels of the end of the Cold War. Communism was not at the forefront, nor was it the problem for the rest of the world. And now it was to destabilize the Middle East. Now, this comes also decades later, in which 1952, there was a policy document by the British Foreign Affairs Office, which was called the problem of Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism, which was prominent under former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. This was before the advent of the Salafist terrorist organizations, which actually took hold of the Arab countries after the Six-Day War because they saw the socialist regimes as nothing more than corrupt regimes that repressed the poor and the religious. The Saudis expanded on this after the oil boom of the 1970s, in which it funded to the tunes of hundreds of millions throughout the world, including most notably Middle East and Southeast Asia, but to the poorest regions of the Arab world, thus creating the vacuum for religious extremism. The report explained a new approach to solving Israel's security problems in the Middle East with Western values, as I said before, Western values. Now, this is a loosely based term, which has really an undefined meaning, but what they really meant to say was neoconservative values. It has since been criticized for advocating an aggressive new policy, including the removal of Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and the containment of Syria by engaging in proxy warfare and highlighting the possession of weapons of mass destruction. For a policy document that was written in 1996, boy, You say that surely came to fruition after 2001, with Iraq being subjected to UN security inspectors in the United States as having chemical and biological weapons when they did not. And of course, isn't that what the United States did to Syria? Engage in proxy warfare by supporting and training Salafist militants to try to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government in 2011. The program ended in 2017, which was co-opted by then CIA Director David Petraeus and authorized by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, King Abdullah II of Jordan. Certain parts of these policies set forth in paper were rejected by Netanyahu initially, but Netanyahu did end up losing the prime minister election. And later on, we had Ehud Barak, and then Netanyahu again for a longer term. Nothing really changed. According to the report's preamble, it was written by the study group on a new Israeli strategy toward 2000, which was a part of the Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. Now, this is an interesting group of dual national citizens of Israel, the United States, who hold nationalist principles, which is exactly the essence of Zionism and Christian evangelicalism. The Institute for Advanced Strategic Political Studies had individuals who signed on to the report, such as Douglas Feith, James Colbert, Charles Fairbanks Jr., Jonathan Torup, David Wormser, Merab Wormser, Robert Lowenberg, and many of these people would go on to have prominent positions in the Bush White House. In reading the report, the very first preface, you could see where the direction of the document is going. It's only 6 pages long, but I'll read the first paragraph. Quote, Israel has a large problem, labor Zionism, which for 70 years has dominated the Zionist movement, has generated a stalled and shackled economy. Efforts to salvage Israel's socialist institutions, which include pursuing supranational over national sovereignty and pursuing a peace process that embraces the slogan New Middle East, undermine the legitimacy of the nation and lead Israel into a strategic paralysis in the previous government's peace process. That peace process obscured the evidence of eroding national critical mass, including a palpable sense of national exhaustion and forfeited strategic initiative. The loss of national critical mass was illustrated best by Israel's efforts to draw in the United States to sell unpopular policies domestically, to agree to negotiate sovereignty over its capital, and to respond with resignation to a state of terror so intense and tragic that it deterred Israelis from engaging in normal daily functions, such as commuting to work in buses, end quote. What they wanted to do was the neoconservatives, the neoconservative think tank, which was basically emanated from the Leo Strauss and Paul Nitschke school, and which was given its start under the Reagan administration, saw Israel as basically a strategy for an extension. Now, many people get the misconception that it's Israel that rules the United States. It's not that easy to explain, but I'll try the best I can. It's the other way around. Israel actually holds only one thing, and that is they have a wide swath of influence in our institutions, major corporations, and as well as having a direct link with the evangelical crowd in the Pentagon and in the State Department. Remember, a lot of these people, White House staffers and advisors, White House aides, all come from a good majority come from Liberty University, which was created under the late Jerry Falwell. Many of the influential politics and policy makers that we see today in both of these powerful institutions, such as the Pentagon and the State Department, have a rich tradition in evangelical Christianity, which by its essence is nationalist. They are not spiritualist people, and they don't adhere to Christ. These are people who adhere to the works of Paul. As for the Israelis, it's an interesting issue regarding how diverse they are in regards to the religious population, which is at odds with the Zionists, but they have one thing in common. And then you have the secularists, but they all have one thing in common, that Israel is to remain a Jewish state. There are minor differences, including the rights of Palestinians, in which the religious favor to an extent, where the Zionists do not. I'll read the second paragraph of the document. Quote, Benjamin Netanyahu's government comes in with a new set of ideas. While there are those who will counsel continuity, Israel has the opportunity to make a clean break. It can forge a peace process and strategy based on an entirely new intellectual formulation, one that restores strategic initiative and provides the nation the room to engage every possible energy on rebuilding Zionism, the starting point of which must be economic reform, to secure the nation's streets and borders in the immediate future. Israel can work closely with Turkey and Jordan to contain, destabilize, and roll back some of its most dangerous threats. This implies clean break from the slogan, comprehensive peace, to the traditional concept of strategy based on balance of power. Change the nature of its relations with the Palestinians, including upholding the right of hot pursuit for self-defense into all Palestinian areas and nurturing alternatives to Arafat's exclusive grip on Palestinian society. Forge a new basis for relations with the United States, stressing self-reliance, maturity, strategic cooperation on areas of mutual concern, and furthering values inherent to the West. This can only be done if Israel takes serious steps to terminate aid which prevents economic reform. End quote. So the introduction specifically proposes three policies, new policies for Israel. In regards to gathering a comprehensive peace with the entire Arab world, Israel should jointly work with Jordan and Turkey to contain, destabilize, and roll back these entities that are threats to all three. Jordan, which are allies to Iran, and Turkey, which has a powerful government and also a fundamentalist point of view at the same time. We have not seen this to the extent of where we have destabilized the other allies to Iran, which is basically Syria, a direct connection to the Shiite community as a whole, in which the Iranians and Hezbollah out of Lebanon have been fighting against the Salafi jihadists, which at that time were covertly supported by the CIA under Operation Timber Sycamore from 2011 to 2017, and also which was authorized by the King of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, which was providing funding to these jihadist groups, which have a link because of their ideology, which has shaped the country, Wahhabism, and the Israeli Zionist regime, which were basically treating members of Jabhat al-Nusra at Golan Heights hospitals, Jewish hospitals. And this is no secret. You can look up articles from The Guardian, the liberal institution Haaretz, in which they've reported that Jewish hospitals at the Golan Heights were treating Salafi jihadists in their fight against the Syrian army. In regards to changing the nature of relations with the Palestinians, specifically reserving the right of hot pursuit anywhere within Palestinian territory, as well as attempting to promote alternatives to Arafat's leadership. Well, we're currently seeing that, aren't we? This is the reason why the Abu Nidal organization, which was the Fatah ANO, was created, because Abu Nidal saw Arafat as basically being too weak or too liberal in regards to Israel. And it just coincidentally, by the way, very convenient, that the Palestinian problem was gaining favor with the European nations such as Germany, France, Switzerland. And so it just so happens that the Abu Nidal organization, which was a militant organization, started to conduct terrorist operations, including the Vienna airport massacre. The changing relations with the United States, stressing self-reliance and strategic cooperation. They don't have to worry about that there because they were getting cooperation, but I can understand why they don't want to rely on the United States so much in regards to aid, because what they wanted to do, the neocons anyway, was to help Israel build its own economic stability, which would give it the competence it needed in their continued degradation of the Palestinian problem without having to worry about critics inside their own country as opposed to outside of it. In the second page on the third paragraph, there is an insert called "A New Approach to Peace." Quote, "Early adoption of a bold new perspective on peace and security is imperative for the new prime minister. While the previous government and many abroad may emphasize land for peace, which placed Israel in the position of a cultural, economic, political, diplomatic, and military retreat, the new government can promote Western values and traditions. Such an approach, which will be well received in the United States, include peace for peace, peace through strength and self-reliance." End quote. They did not want to share any more land or give up any more land to the Palestinians than they would have originally have liked. The United States saw the problem with this in regards to the Palestinians possessing more power in the years to come. And they wanted to keep Israel as the staging point for military expansionism. They consider Israel a part of the United States because it's a key strategic position between Iran and the Gulf, as well as Southeast Asia. The problem is that by subjugating the Palestinians, the world response had to have played a part in condemning the barbaric practices of the Zionist regime. Were they not worried about this? Well, the neoconservatives weren't too concerned about this at the time. Remember, this is 1996. In 20 years, I would say that the critics have now been more vociferous now than they were then. And we've seen this come in waves where you have a number of people that are sympathetic to the Israelis, and then on a flip of a dime, it's sympathetic for the Arab problem, the Palestinian problem. But the more power the Israelis have in regards to destabilizing regimes and putting in puppet ones, which are Western influenced, they wouldn't have to worry about an Arab conglomerate. They already have the Gulf. which are basically trying to normalize relations with Israel, and very few Arab governments are trained do not do that. Algeria is one, and Turkey is another. Iran is the key point here, and the key staging point. It's the reason why the Israelis and the Saudis have been quite open in regards to having the United States act as big brother and military invade the country, because they are trying to build a nuclear weapon. What do they care? Israel has over 80 nuclear weapons, and it could be more. Nobody knows, because it's the only country that doesn't allow vetting of their nuclear stockpile. I wonder why. What are they hiding? There's another paragraph in the document called Securing the Northern Border. Quote, Syria challenges Israel on Lebanese soil, an effective approach and one with which Americans can sympathize would be if Israel seized the strategic initiative along its northern borders by engaging Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran as the principal agents of aggression in Lebanon, including by striking Syria's drug money and counterfeiting infrastructure in Lebanon, all of which focuses on Razi Canaan, paralleling Syria's behavior by establishing the precedent that Syrian territory is not immune to attacks emanating from Lebanon by Israeli proxy forces, striking Syrian military targets in Lebanon, and should prove insufficient, striking at select targets in Syria proper, end quote. The final two paragraphs are on point, and that's what we're seeing today. It's only because of the Soviets and the Iranians who have come to the aid of the Assad government that the Islamists didn't take over the country, and that a large swath of the Islamic State in Levant have been destroyed, even though they were getting help from the United States and the Gulf. Israel can take the opportunity to remind the world of the nature of the Syrian regime, in which Syria repeatedly breaks its word, according to the document. It's the other way around, actually. The document would also paraphrase that, given the nature of the regime in Damascus, it is both natural and moral that Israel abandon the slogan comprehensive peace and move to contain Syria by drawing attention to its weapons of mass destruction programs and rejecting land for peace deals on the Golan Heights. I think that's absurd in its own right. They're worried about containing Syria because of their weapons for mass destruction programs, and they don't have either. In fact, the chemical weapons they have were from the original Iran-Iraq conflict in 1980, in which it was the United States who looked the other way when Iraq used biological and chemical weapons on the Iranian borders. Pretty hypocritical when you think about it. And then later on, when Iraq served its purpose, it then became a suspect or a victim, which we could say is a product of the clean break strategy. The chemical weapons that they had at the time, which was given to them in part by Turkey and the Gulf partners, as well as the United States, now could say, well, look, they have a weapons and chemical biological weapons program. Well, that weapons program, in which they're talking about in 2001, was the stockpile that 20 years earlier was given to them. The document itself also contains another area called moving to a traditional balance of power strategy. Quote, Israel can shape its strategic environment in cooperation with Turkey and Jordan by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. This effort can focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambitions. Jordan has challenged Syria's regional ambitions recently by suggesting the restoration of the Hashemites in Iraq. This has triggered a Jordanian-Syrian rivalry to which Assad has responded by stepping up efforts to destabilize the Hashemite kingdom, including using infiltrations. Syria recently signaled that it and Iran might prefer a weak but barely surviving Saddam, if only to undermine and humiliate Jordan in its efforts to remove Saddam, end quote. Well, to emphasize the point that Israel regards the actions of Syria as problematic, I think most importantly, it is understandable that Israel has a vested interest supporting diplomatically, militarily, and probably operationally Turkey and Jordan's actions against Syria. And that's because what they wanted to do was create Syria and divide it into groups. Like they're trying to do in Libya when they overthrew the Gaddafi regime, when the country didn't have an Islamist problem, which now is into a civil war with the Liberation Front and also the small warring Islamist factions. Another interesting point was most of these countries, and I just did a video about Arab nationalism last night, in which, from my studies over the years, countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, didn't have an Islamist problem. They enjoyed relative community. It was quite westernized. And the fear was that the United States couldn't have a vested influx or an influence within the Middle East because of the fear that the Arab world would exist as a sole entity, or a group of countries which have the sole purpose was to not have the West as a major influence in its politics and through the oil program, or regulate the oil. But there was one problem with that, was that the Saudis have already chosen the United States as their sole representative. The Britons, they tried in the early 20th century to gain as much influence within Saudis as much as possible by purchasing some of their most expensive that Saudi Arabia started purchasing weapons from Great Britain, tanks, anti-aircraft missiles, in which the United States then brokered a partnership in which they would have more political influence in the United States Congress. Of course, forging, there's a certain part of the document which talks about forging a new U.S.-Israeli relationship. Quote, in recent years, Israel invited active U.S. intervention in Israel's domestic and foreign policy for two reasons: to overcome domestic opposition to land for peace concessions the Israeli public could not digest, and to lure Arabs through money, forgiveness of past sins, and access to U.S. weapons to negotiate. This strategy, which required funneling American money to repressive and aggressive regimes, was risky, expensive, and very costly for both the United States and Israel, and placed the U.S. in roles it should neither have nor want. Israel can make a clean break from the past and establish a new vision for the U.S.-Israeli partnership based on self-reliance, maturity, and mutuality, not one focused narrowly on territorial disputes. Israel's new strategy, based on shared philosophy of peace through strength, reflects continuity with Western values by stressing that Israel is self-reliant and does not need U.S. troops in any capacity to defend it, including on the Golan Heights, and can manage its own affairs. Such self-reliance will grant Israel greater freedom of action and remove a significant lever of pressure used against it in the past, end quote. There's a lot of power in this because what we're seeing now is Israel trying to become independent. And it's almost like raising a child. Well, the U.S. still gives it weapons. military-grade weapons, helicopters, planes, in which it doesn't produce. In regards to self-reliance, well, it's called neglect on the U.S. part, especially when it comes to the Palestinian problem. Well, the problem with Jordan and the Golan Heights is that the United States is willing to look away when the problem is faced against the Palestinians, knowing that what they're doing by raising land, destroying homes, is in direct violation of international law and in direct violation of humanitarian law by destroying Palestinian land in favor of building Israeli settlement homes and neighborhoods, all which is in violation of international law. And Israel knows this, and they do it defiantly, knowing that the United States will not be bothered to intervene. And this holds a wide sway of power in the United Nations. Of course, you'll have Arab nations such as Northern Africa, who basically condemn the settler homes, but they have a very small voice in the United Nations. And of course, there's always going to be an outrage from the global community, but you don't have power. You don't make decisions in policy unless you vote. But the problem with voting is that no matter who you vote, whether it's Democratic or Republican, they're not going to change the process, because the process is that the Israeli AIPAC committee, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, is that they are such a powerful influence in both the House and Senate and the Republican Democratic parties that nothing will ever change in favor of the Palestinians. No matter if the squad, like Ilhan Omar or Alexandria Cortez or Cori Bush, none of these people can make the necessary changes, because the older voices, like Nancy Pelosi, who act as a guide for the squad, are basically AIPAC bought and paid for. These are the people that go to AIPAC annually. And if you haven't seen any AIPAC conferences, I have a whole playlist dedicated to this, where you can see for yourself the power and the wide swath of influence regarding the Israeli lobby and how they persuade our politics in favor of them. And this is the reason why a clean break strategy is basically policy. Even though Netanyahu had initially rejected the policy, it still is being implemented to the T in certain areas. Not all of them, but certain ones. You could say that for Syria, especially in the Palestinians. The influence, the certain aspects set forth in the Clean Break report, was initially rejected by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, according to Brian Whitaker, who reported in a September 2002 article in The Guardian, by the way, the article was The Guardian, quote, with several of the Clean Break papers authors now holding key positions in Washington, the plan for Israel to transcend its foes by reshaping the Middle East looks a good deal more achievable today than it did in 1996. Americans may even be persuaded to give up their lives to achieve it, end quote. Now, that's true, because in 1996, many people disregarded the article as surely neoconservative propaganda, and it wouldn't work. Something that was outside the lines. They couldn't see that happening. But that's exactly what happened, because after the Clinton administration, in which he was basically forced out of the administration because of the Monica Lewinsky scandal and his failure to eliminate Osama bin Laden. When the Bush administration took over, all the policy hawks under him, like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, they took over the policy changes of the White House. Their policy changes were from documents like the Clean Break Strategy and the Paul Wolfowitz doctrine, which basically coincides with the agendas of the clean break. Now, I think in 2003, it was Patrick Buchanan, the former assistant special consultant to President Nixon, Gerald Ford. He referred to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and he wrote that the report was, quote, their plan, which urged Israel to reestablish the principle of preemption, end quote, which was imposed by Perle, Feit, Wormser, and company. Well, he's right. Look at that. A hardcore Republican like Buchanan. And now Ian Baruma wrote in August 2003 in the New York Times, quote, Douglas Feit and Richard Perle advised Netanyahu, was the prime minister in 96, to make a clean break from the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians. They also argued that Israeli security would be best served by regime change in surrounding countries. Despite the current mess in Iraq, this is still a commonplace in Washington. And in Paul Wolfowitz's words, the road to peace in the Middle East goes through Baghdad. It has indeed become an article of faith in Washington that American and Israeli interests are identical, but this was not always so, and Jewish interests are not the main reason for it now, end quote. That's right. That's exactly right. The report is indeed a U.S. Israeli neoconservative manifesto in regards to the mini Cold War of the Middle East, the new Cold War. But this time it would use a different approach. Military expansionism by way of committing to a war on terrorism, which is an undefined enemy. And it was the reason for that was basically most wars in the past had a defined enemy. The war on terrorism is an undefined enemy. Pretty ingenious idea when you think about it. And that's the kind of mindsets that we're dealing with under the Bush administration, which was basically the same thing under Obama. And for those who think that the neoconservatives are basically just strictly right-wing or Republican, well, that's not always been the case. Historically, they switch. They go from Democratic to Republican Party. They intermingle, interorganize. The document itself has basically been a complete disaster for global hegemony in the region. And so I'm going to end the video on that. I hope it was educational for you. I just wanted to bring it to your reminder that the policies of the neoconservatives and the Israelis under a document like the Clean Break do have some type of influence in today's politics, more so now than they did in 1996.